We have a full committee hearing this morning to discuss the fiscal year 2021 National Defense Authorizing Budget request for the Department of the Navy. And we are joined by three witnesses this morning. The Honorable Thomas Modly, Acting Secretary of the Navy, Admiral Michael Gilday, Chief of Naval Operations, and General David Berger, the Commandant for the U.S. Marine Corps. Gentlemen, thank you all for being here. Appreciate your willingness to testify and also your service to our country. All the work that you do to help make sure that we have the strongest military we possibly can and meet our national security objectives. We kicked off our posture hearing season yesterday with the Secretary of Defense and the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And I think got a pretty good overview of the overall budget. And now we are going to work our way through piece by piece. And I think the most interesting thing is what the Department of Defense has undertaken, that I know you all are participating in as well, that has come to be called the blank slate review. Basically an effort to look at everything that we are doing within the military and reassess. Figure out where we could potentially save money, where we should spend more, and how we need to realign our priorities to make sure that they match up with the national security strategy that was put in place over a year ago now, I believe. The overarching theme of that is the notion of great power competition and the reemergence of that, which reemerged a while ago, but dealing with Russia and China and how that enabled, how we should realign our forces and realign our defense priorities to meet that challenge. And I think that is the most difficult question, and one that we definitely want to hear from all of you today in terms of how it specifically impacts the Navy and the Marine Corps. What do you need to do differently? Where are you short assets? Where can assets be transferred from? And how do we balance all of those complex needs? And the great challenge here, of course, is we do not have infinite resources. The budget is what the budget is. So if we come to you and say, we want you to do more here, logically, you're going to have to do less somewhere else. I do realize that efficiencies are part of that. We discussed a little bit yesterday the move towards an audit, trying to make sure that we create greater efficiency in the acquisition and procurement process. I know Ranking Member Thornberry has done an enormous amount of work on that. All of that done, we still have to make choices within the budget. And you gentlemen are in the position to best understand those choices and why you've made the ones you have. So hearing from you how you prioritize where you want the money spent is going to be enormously important. We are specifically concerned, and I know Congressman Courtney will express these concerns better than I can, about some of the reductions in the shipbuilding accounts and money that apparently was transferred around in the President's budget at the last minute that among other things, required the reduction of one attack submarine, how we're going to meet those needs. And overall in that area, I am interested in, we've been talking about a 355-ship Navy, I think, for the entire time that I've been in Congress. I think they had a different number when I started, but I forget what that number was. It's almost meaningless at this point, since it's like 20, 30 years out. We're going to try to get to that number. What I'm more interested in is what do we have now? What are we likely to have in the next 5 years? How does it meet our needs, and how do we plan for the future? It's great to have goals, I suppose, and we can aspire towards that number, but at this point, it seems like just that, an aspiration. It doesn't translate necessarily into a strategy, so I'm more interested in how the short-term strategy works on that front. So we look forward to your testimony, and we have many questions, and it will help inform us as we get ready to produce the National Defense Authorizing Act this year. And with that, I turn it over to the Ranking Member, Mr. Thornberry, for any opening comments he has.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I join you in welcoming our witnesses today and also thanking each of them for their service and their many contributions to the country's defense. As Chairman referenced, there was considerable conversation yesterday with the Secretary and the Chairman about Navy shipbuilding. It was interesting to me, one of the benefits the Chairman and I have is we get to be here from the front till the beginning to the end of these hearings. And while there was a lot of concern about this year's budget, as the conversation evolved, there seemed to be more questions about, okay, where's the Navy headed in a longer term sense? not just numbers of ships, but characteristics of ships and capabilities and so forth. And so I do think members are interested to get that sort of where we're headed, and that will enable us to do a better job not only this year but in the future. And similarly, reference was made to potential changes coming to the Marine Corps. And so I think while we will focus, of course, on this year's budget, as the chairman referenced, changes in warfare, moving from as much emphasis on counterterrorism toward great power competition, means that all the services will have to make some changes, maybe your two as much as any. So we look forward to hearing from you, and again, thanks for being here.
Thank you. Mr. Modley.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of this committee, thank you for your bipartisan efforts on behalf of our sailors, Marines, and civilians in the Department of the Navy. It's a true honor for me to be here today with Admiral Gilday and General Berger, both of whom have demonstrated great commitment to each other and to each other's respective naval service as they have worked collaboratively to lead our integrated American naval force. Consistent with that spirit, we've taken a different approach to the written testimony this year, as you've received. We've submitted one unified document instead of three separate statements. And staying ahead in today's rapidly changing global strategic environment demands that our naval forces commit to unified planning, clear-eyed assessments, and sometimes some very, very hard choices. In this process, we must harmonize competing priorities, sustain our critical industrial base, and not allow our maritime competitive advantage to erode relative to global competitors and, more accurately stated, aggressive adversaries who wish to hasten our decline as a global force for liberty and decency around the world. In the end, this budget submission is a manifestation of the hard choices we had to make this year, but it is centrally about our sailors and Marines, their safety and their security and their well-being and their families. Ultimately, I ask that you recognize that in this submission, we could not make trades that put our sailors and Marines on platforms and with equipment that are not ready for a fight if that fight is what is required of them. While this budget does slow our trajectory to a force of 355 ships or more, it does not arrest it. You have my personal assurance that we are still deeply committed to building that larger, more capable, more distributed naval force within what I consider a strategically relevant time frame of no more than 10 years. I look forward to working with this committee and the entire Congress in the coming months as we develop realistic plans to do so. Our budget also demonstrates a clear commitment to the education of our people as we implement the recommendations of the Education for Sea Power study that I led while serving as the Undersecretary of the Navy for the last 2 years. We are establishing a Naval Community College for our enlisted personnel as part of a bold and unified naval education strategy that recognizes that the intellectual and ethical development of our people is going to be the most critical element of our success as a naval force. We are also stepping up our efforts to meet our solemn commitment to our military families through significantly more engaged oversight and accountability of our public-private venture housing program. Finally, I would like this committee to understand that as leaders of the Department of the Navy, we are both vocal and united in our determination to prevent sexual assault and sexual harassment throughout our force. Every sailor, every Marine, and every Navy civilian deserves individual dignity, respect, and protection from this great naval institution that we have the honor to lead. We have a lot of work to do in this regard, but you have my personal commitment that we take it very, very seriously, and we're going after it every day. We are grateful to the committee for passing this year's NDAA, which enables many of the priorities identified within this document. In passing this legislation, you've sent a strong signal of support to our people and a stern warning to our adversaries around the world. We also appreciate the funding stability and predictability of the last several years. This has saved a lot of money for the American taxpayers and given our force the agility and flexibility to address emerging threats while investing in our integrated force. We urge this committee to do what it can to continue this stability in the future so that we can implement the reforms and investments required to meet the great power challenges we face, protect the maritime commons, and defend the United States of America. Thank you for your time, and we look forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Admiral Gilday, were you going to make a statement? Okay, go ahead.
Chairman Smith.
And if you could be sure and pull the microphone down in front of you there.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of the committee, good morning. And thank you for the opportunity to appear today with Secretary Modly and General Berger, and for your enduring support of the Navy Marine Corps team. I'd also like to point out that my wife, Linda, joins me this morning. I'll be brief, sir. I'd like to address some of the points that both of you made in your opening statements, and this really gets down to priorities. So in our budget submission for this year, the Navy has 4 priorities. The first is to fully fund the Columbia-class submarine. So that nuclear seaborne deterrent that this nation depends upon is aging out. By the time we replace the Ohio hull, it'll have 42 years in the water. And so we need to deliver Columbia on time for its first patrol in 2031. Numbers 2 and 3 are readiness and lethality. We are catching up and closing gaps that we've created over the past 15 to 20 years. And so in order to come to this committee and ask for more money for a larger fleet, we need to make sure that we can maintain and sustain the fleet that we have. And so those are 2 priorities for us, and our budget reflects that. In terms of lethality, we are closing gaps against near-peer competitors by investing in capabilities that have range and that have speed. 21% of our budget is invested in closing those gaps against our near-peer competitor. All the time, while we're doing those top 3 priorities, we are still investing in capacity. The size of the fleet is growing. It's just not growing at the pace that some would prefer. And to meet those priorities, we've had to make some hard choices inside the Navy, and that includes decommissioning some legacy platforms that don't bring lethality to the fight. So with those comments, sir, I thank you again for your time this morning.
Thank you. General Berger.
Chairman Smith, Ranking Member Thornberry, distinguished members of this committee.
I appreciate the opportunity to testify on the posture of your Marine Corps and our priorities for our future. And I'll start by echoing Secretary Modly and Admiral Gilday's thanks for timely funding, as well as your enduring commitment to Marines, sailors, and their families through efforts like the hurricane recovery effort and funding that you provided last year, and the revision to the public-private venture housing program. Your bipartisan support is critical to ensure that we continue to prioritize people as our greatest resource. Thanks to predictable funding over the past few years, your Marine Corps has made significant progress in restoring both availability and readiness. We are now at an inflection point. We have to pivot now toward modernization while sustaining the readiness that this committee has resourced. This pivot, in my opinion, cannot wait until next year or the following. We must move now, or risk overmatch in the future by an adversary, and that is a risk we will not take. As the National Defense Strategy directs, and as Secretary Modly recently emphasized in his first vector to all hands, we must pursue urgent change at a significant scale. Marines have always sensed when it's time to move out smartly. We don't hesitate. This is that time. Realizing the bold direction of our strategic guidance requires acknowledging fundamental changes in the operating environment, and that means how we must train, organize, and equip the force. I believe most leaders recognize that significant changes are required, yet the scope and pace of necessary change is seemingly at odds with some historical resource allocations and major acquisition programs which predate the National Defense Strategy. This budget submission marks the beginning for the Marine Corps of a focused effort to better align resources with strategic objectives. Our future budget submissions will build on these investment decisions with informed recommendations for force design modifications and adjustment to our programs of record. Together, in partnership with Admiral Gilday and under the direction of Secretary Modly, we are committed to delivering the integrated naval and marine forces that our nation requires. As always, I welcome the opportunity to discuss our findings along the way and keep each of you and your staffs informed as we progress. We will be frugal with the resources we are given. We will ask for no more than we need. With Congress's commitment and support, we will ensure your Marines continue to have every advantage when we send them into harm's way. And I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, General. Could you, as a starting point, quantify for us the readiness gains, where we were at, where we come to, how much further we need to go, taking your point on the procurement needs now that are paramount? Explain to us where you're at in readiness, where you were, where you're at, where you think you need to be.
Chairman, I'll probably just use a couple examples. First of all, TAC Air, fixed wing aviation. 3 years ago, if memory serves me right, we were in the mid to upper 50s across the F-18 and Harrier community, and we were just introducing the F-35. And 50% is not the readiness that you all expect. Last year, the goal that the Secretary outlined and we both strove towards was 80%, and we in fact achieved that. We would never have made that without the resources that Congress provided. Ground side, similar picture. Because of Iraq and Afghanistan, we had rode our forces, our equipment pretty hard, and we had postponed maintenance. In the last 2 or 3 years, we have recovered that.
Terrific, thank you. Admiral, could you help me out with the 355 ship thing? I think it is really important, as the ranking member pointed out, what are the capabilities we need? What are the specific types of ship? How do you sort of balance that focus in terms of what types of ship you're building, what capabilities you need, with the off-stated goal of having 355 ships? And when is it? I forget the date when we're supposed to achieve that number. How do those two things mesh in terms of your plans? I don't think you, Mike. There we go.
To your point, it is about capabilities. And so when we take a look at what we need in the Navy as part of the Joint Force, we're taking a look at what unique capabilities the Navy can bring to the fight that other services can't. And so it is a analytical approach within the Pentagon to try and make the best investments now to close capability gaps against both the Chinese and the Russians. So a couple of examples of the Navy in terms of the air wings that are embarked on aircraft carriers. So no other place in the military do we have an airfield that I can move 700 miles a day and at the same time provide the integrated capability of early warning, electronic attack, anti-submarine warfare, air-to-ground, air-to-air, and logistics. All the while you have a self-sustaining platform that, again, is mobile. At the same time, we bring unique capabilities with respect to ballistic missile defense and anti-submarine warfare on our destroyers and with our submarines as well. And so those fold into that joint mix in terms of what the Navy can contribute to the joint fight, and that translates into platforms. And so simply that's kind of the quadratic equation that yields a number of ships, but it also takes into account attrition models in a fight. It also takes into account what other missions we need to conduct around the globe in accordance with the National Defense Strategy. So that would include deterring another near-peer competitor conventionally, strategically, being able to respond to additional threats, assuring allies and partners. Those also fold into the equation, as well as a strategic reserve bench in case we do get into.
So sorry, but what's the point of the 355 goal? Mr. Motley, if you want.
Chairman, do you mind if I address this question? So it's not a random number. It's a number that's basically benchmarked off of a study that was done in 2016, the force structure assessment.
But when is it that we're saying that we're going to need the 355 ships?
I'm sorry, sir. I didn't.
When are we planning on?
Well, it's my objective to try to get us there within 10 years. That is a strategy I'm trying to drive through, and it's not just a random number. It's driven by strategy. It's driven by the capabilities we think we need. I will also say it's improper for us to be benchmarking against a static number. What we're trying to develop in the Department of the Navy is more of an iterative process to look at that number so that we can understand how we might adjust certain ship categories based on how we perceive the security environment evolving. The security environment is not static. We have to develop a force that's agile, that we can quickly adjust certain ship categories as we see that we need them. We just completed an integrated force structure assessment that was led by the Commandant and the CNO for the first time together, trying to determine, as we look at that future security environment in a 10-year horizon, and we have to take it with some reality here, because it takes a long time to get ships designed and built and into an industrial base that can support it. But in the 10-year horizon, as we looked at those numbers again, they actually ended up increasing. But the mix is different. So what I'm trying to emphasize is that it's the 355 was pegged to a force structure assessment that was done 4 years ago. We are trying to develop a process in the Navy where we constantly look at this, constantly iterate this, give good signals to industry so they can adjust with it.
Understood. One last question on that. So looking at that 10-year goal, how does the money that was taken out of shipbuilding that cost us that submarine, number one, in this budget, which was not in the original president's budget, that was taken out, as I understand it, to fund the NNSA at a higher level. How does that, plus the cuts that you're now facing from the money being reprogrammed for the wall and the programs that are cut, how do those things impact your ability to meet those goals?
Well, to be frank, it's not helpful because it takes a ship out of a plan that we're driving towards. It particularly is harmful in the sense that it takes a ship out of a category of ship for which we're going to have a hard time getting to anyway. We feel like we need to have at least 66 attack submarines. Even on the 10-year trajectory, based on industrial base capacity, we think we can get to about 49 or 50. So it takes out one. If we can get to 48 instead of 49, that impacts that number. But that's, so of course, any ship that comes out of the process of in any given year is going to impact our ability to get there as quickly as I'd like to. So,
thank you. Mr. Thornberry.
As I look at the numbers, the shipbuilding account is down, what, about $4 billion from last year, and the readiness O&M account for the Navy is up about $3.6 billion from last year. Basically, the same. The cuts and the increases. So could either of you, Ms. Secretary or Admiral, give me a little deeper explanation for why the emphasis needs to be, in your view, on the O&M part this year?
I'll take it initially, and then I'll turn it over to the CNO. But I think what I tried to basically say in my opening statement was we did make that trade. It was an intentional trade because our decision was that at this particular time, because of the readiness hole that we had fallen into over many, many years, we needed to address that first and foremost, because that immediately impacts the safety and security of the sailors and Marines that we put out on these platforms. We could not in good conscience trade that money for more ships that could not operate properly. With the right equipment and with the right readiness. And so that's the trade we made. We have to look now, as we look from 22 forward, how do we afford this larger Navy and maintain the readiness? And those are the challenges, and that's being pressurized by a lot of things, such as the Columbia recapitalization, which is a necessary part of our national security. But we are looking internally to see what we can do, to look at our own budget first, to see what we can do to find additional funds to drive that.
And Admiral, as you describe this, can you give us, you got what, ships that are not deployable? Kind of what is this readiness priority in a practical, concrete way?
Yes, sir. So big picture, I believe that we need a Navy that's ready, that's capable and lethal, more than we need a bigger Navy that's less ready, less capable, less lethal. And so the money that we're putting into the readiness accounts, right, specifically if we talk about manpower. So when I commanded a destroyer, we had over 300 sailors on a destroyer. We went down to 245. We had collisions in the Pacific. We learned a lot, lessons learned in blood. We're now buying that manpower back. We'll be at 265 this year. We'll come out to 285 in those destroyers in 2023 as an example. We have gaps at sea. Those gaps need to be filled so our ships are fully manned, for all the reasons that you well know. So we are buying back those people. There are years when the Navy has shedded people faster than we shedded ships, and the size of the Navy has declined since I've been in uniform in 1985. But the people piece is where you can get money fast, And it's a really attractive place to go after money, and we're saying we're not going to do that. We're going to buy back that manpower that we know that we need on our ships. In terms of training for that manpower, what we also learned from those collisions that we need to do a much better job at training our sailors at sea. We've put significant investments in live virtual training as an example, simulators that are world class, and we have those at all of our fleet concentration areas. In terms of modernization, so we're modernizing our ships. We've taken a holiday for a while and keeping up with a 70% of the fleet that we have today we're going to have in 2030. And so we have to take care of that fleet. So in terms of modernization, we're putting new systems on there to make our ships more lethal. And we're filling the magazines with weapons. And the investments we're making in weapons are those that have range and speed. So for years, we've invested in defensive systems because we haven't had a hot breath down the back of our neck. Now that hot breath is China. So we're closing those gaps. That essentially is our hope answered your question on why that's where the focus is, at the expense of growing a Navy at a precipitous pace. And so,
Okay. Let me just ask one other question. Lots of flack yesterday about not having a 30-year shipbuilding plan come with the budget. Any idea when we might see such a thing?
Representative Thornberry, the issue with the 30-year shipbuilding plan is that we developed this integrated force structure assessment, and we presented it to the Secretary of Defense. He wanted some time and some space to look at that, analyze it, and understand how that would impact a 30-year shipbuilding plan. So unfortunately, it was a confluence of events this year that we did not. We submitted our budget. The force structure assessment was delivered, and we didn't have time to really iterate that, talk to him about it, test it before we submitted a 30-year shipbuilding plan. But we will work with him. Hopefully in a couple months, we'll be able to submit that.
Okay, thank you.
So two quick things before we go to the rest of the questioning. First of all, we have a 5-minute clock for everyone, and the witnesses need to be helpful to me. Once you get down close to that 5 minutes, if you could try to wrap up so that I don't have to interrupt you, that would be great. Second, Mr. Garamendi has an introduction he wants to do quickly.
If I might, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Very quickly, the 75th anniversary of Hiroshima is upon us. Wandering into my office today is a 98-year-old veteran of Hiroshima, Purple Heart. Clinton Tafena is down here in the front row. His unit was the first on the beach, an engineering unit. He was wounded in that battle, and I'd like to welcome him. And General, Commandant, he said he's got a few things he can tell you about how to do it right.
Thank you very much, sir. Thank you, John.
He was just recently given his new license from the California Department of Vehicles. The Highway Patrol caught him a couple of days after that, traveling at over 100 miles an hour, and when the highway patrolman said, do you know how fast he was going? He said, yes, 2 miles an hour over my age.
Thank you. On that note, Ms. Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to all of you for your service to our country and certainly for being with us today. I wanted to go back to the issue that we began talking about yesterday. And as you may know, I had asked General Milley about the cut to the Virginia-class submarine. We've referenced that already today, to increase nuclear weapons programs. And he said that while he supported fully funding the nuclear arsenal, the last-minute change was not supported by his best military advice. And I know that's been mentioned again. Could you share your thoughts about that so we have a better understanding about how that occurred? I was addressing that to the Admiral, but Mr. Secretary, do you want to?
Ma'am, I was not directly involved in those discussions. It happened at budget endgame very quickly, and we were informed after the decision was made.
Okay, and Mr. Secretary, I think you addressed it
That's
already.
exactly the way it
Okay.
happens. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. That's helpful, and maybe further discussions about how, again, Congress can play a stronger role in that as well. In this budget, shipbuilding has also seen cuts in logistics and support vessels like oilers. And I wonder if you could talk about the way forward with those programs as well. Where are we? Where should we be going?
Yes, ma'am, thanks. As you probably know, we have a new class of oiler that we're building, and we'll reach its initial operating capability in just a couple of years. So we're replacing an aging fleet of oilers. We're also beginning to make investments in strategic sea lift. And so that's another area of the budget, just like the Columbia-class submarine, just like our infrastructure ashore, where we haven't made significant investments in a while. So the Congress has given us the authorities to buy used vessels. And so we were buying 2 used vessels in 2021, and the authorities to buy up to 7 of those. At the same time, we're doing R&D in a new class of affordable sea lift platform. At the same time, we did service life extension on 6 of our older ships last year. We're going to double that this year, and we're going to triple that next year in 21 with this request. I hope that answers your question, ma'am, in terms of...
Sure, and you feel that that's going to get us where we need to be?
No, ma'am.
Oh,
so,
okay.
So
where do we need to be?
We take a look at pressure points within our top line, and that's among them. We are giving it attention, but it's just a long time to catch up with that aging fleet, given its size.
Thank you. The Navy, as you know, has been offering unmanned systems and has developed multiple programs of record on systems that were never fielded. In FY21, the Navy proposed the serial production of the large unmanned surface vessel before prototyping and testing are complete. Considering the history, is it prudent to continue serial production of large unmanned surface vessels before the prototyping and testing are complete? Mr. Secretary, you want to answer?
Yes, absolutely. Well, we have to really accelerate our investment in unmanned platforms, and that's what we're trying to do. And we're trying to do it on a reasonable pace so that we can understand how these technologies might work, and more importantly, how they might operate together. So without having the platforms, it's very difficult for us to do that type of testing, that type of integrated testing that we would need to do. So we are proceeding, we think, in a somewhat cautious pace to do this, but it's absolutely going to be part of whatever future force structure we have. And so we need to start experimenting with concepts, understanding how the technology will work.
Thank you. You know that the Navy struggles to forecast ship depot maintenance. That's a big, tough issue for everybody, and has recently requested congressional approval to cover approximately $1 billion of shortfalls in this account. This creates unpredictability, of course, for industry and diminishes Congress's confidence that the Navy is effectively managing this huge and critical enterprise. What are you doing to better predict the schedule and costs of ships and submarine maintenance availabilities?
Ma'am, I'm mindful of the time, Mr. Chairman, but so as you point out, we've had challenges with depot level maintenance on our ships. Most recently, we've only been able to get about 30 to 35% of our ships out of the shipyards on time. That's been a priority of the Navy to turn that around. We want to reduce 80% of our delay days this year. Right now, 63% of our ships are coming out of maintenance on time through 20. And we want to eliminate all those delays by the end of 21. So it's very aggressively. We've done a lot of analytical work. We found out, as an example, that many of the delays, about 25%, could be attributed to poor forecasting and planning up front. That's our fault in the Navy. And so we took a round turn on that. Additionally, we're taking a look at bundling contracts for private...
And we will have to leave it at that. Mr. Wilson.
Thank you.
Mr. Wilson's recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank each of you for being here. And I particularly appreciate you being here. I'm a grateful Navy dad. And I have a son who's been an orthopedic surgeon and serving today, has previously served in Iraq with the SEALs and the Rangers. So we just so appreciate our family being part of the Navy family. Additionally, Secretary Modly, the National Defense Strategy lays out the rebuilding military readiness as we face a more lethal joint force as a distinct line of effort. The Navy's FY21 request for F-35 Joint Strike Fighters include 5 less than last year and 6 less than FY19. Topping the Navy's unfunded priorities list, however, is $525.5 million for 5 F-35C carrier variants. How is the naval readiness and ultimately military readiness impacted by these aircraft not being funded, and what is the Navy's plan to compensate for the shortfall?
Well, as you know, sir, we did put that in. It's the number 2 item on our unfunded priorities list. We would obviously love to have those aircraft, but again, when we got into the final budget deliberations, we felt that we could trade that without severely impacting our readiness over the long term and try to pick it up in future years.
Thank you. And General Berger, I previously represented Marine Corps Air Station Beaufort, and one of the great achievements was for that community that just really loves the Marine Corps Air Station. They love the sound of freedom, all right, when it flies over. They do not complain. And so that's why they help recruit and support F-35s to be located there. By replacing the 4th-generation planes at Beaufort with 5th-generation aircraft, what is the current process and what challenges do you foresee?
Sir, 2.5 years ago, we sent the first squadron to Iwakuni. Last year, they went on ship. A year and a half ago, they went on ship. We're moving fast. In our view, comparing the Harrier against the F-35 is pretty striking. And all you need to do is listen to the media in Indo-Pacific on the other side to find out what the impact of a squadron of F-35s on board an amphibious ship floating around out there. There's no difference, or there's no comparison. In Beaufort, and on the east and west coast, moving as fast as we can to get out of F-18s and Harriers and into F-35s. That is our goal.
Well, we appreciate it, and they are, if ever there's a community that will welcome it, it's Beaufort, South Carolina, and the state of South Carolina. And Admiral Gilday, I'm grateful that the Navy is fielding W-76-2 low-yield warheads earlier this month. The Nuclear Posture Review identifies the requirement to modify a small number of submarine-launched ballistic missile warheads to combat potential adversaries with low-yield nuclear weapons for peace through strength. However, the W-76-2 is one of 2 variants of the W-76, which just completed its service life extension program. These systems will require modernization in the coming years as their cores are increasingly older. What steps is the Navy taking to ensure the seamless modernization of these systems and to ensure that the naval readiness is not impacted by the growing nuclear threat?
Yes, sir. Thanks for the question about low-yield nuclear weapons. We are making investments right now in modernizing our nuclear weapons inventory, and so that's included in that plan. That'll take a number of years in order to close, but it is included.
Well, I particularly appreciate it because I know the Savannah River Nuclear Laboratory is very vital and very, again, enthusiastic to work with you. Sadly, in 2017, I visited the Fitzgerald in Japan, which so many American sailors were tragically and to me just shockingly killed. What lessons have we learned? What steps have we taken to avoid any further accidents such as the Fitzgerald and the McCain?
Yes, sir. I know you're aware of the comprehensive review we've done and the phases we've gone through in order to institutionalize what we learned from both of those collisions. I will actually be traveling to Pascagoula, Mississippi tomorrow, and I'll be aboard the Fitzgerald, and we're going to talk about many of those issues.
And I hope every effort's made for an early warning advanced system for the best for our sailors.
Sir,
Thank you, and I'm
yes,
grateful to be and yield the balance of my time.
Thank you. Mr. Langevin.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank Secretary Modly, Admiral Gilday, and General Berger for being here today, for your testimony, and all that you do on behalf of our nation. I want to begin by applauding your efforts with the recent Education for Sea Power study to enhance professional military education and increase opportunities for our enlisted sailors and Marines to earn accredited technical degrees. I think it's absolutely essential that we continue to educate all of our service members wherever possible and provide them these opportunities. It was a big priority for former chairman of this committee, Ike Skelton, who believed greatly in professional military education, and something that has stuck with me during my time here on the committee. On another topic, I appreciate both the chairman and my colleague, Ms. Davis, for raising the concern about the cut to the Virginia-class submarine in this year's presidential budget. I don't think it's the time that we should be cutting, and it does concern me, Admiral, that that decision was made after the fact and not, it seems, with your input. That does not inspire confidence here that we're making decisions based on our military needs versus what some may be doing with playing around with budget numbers. But that being said, Secretary Modly, in your recent Vector 12, you emphasized the importance of continued increased undersea dominance for the long run. The most obviously survivable leg of the nuclear triad, the Columbia-class submarine, is essential to that mission. My question, Secretary Modly or Admiral Gilday, is the Columbia-class submarine vital for our success in great power competition? And would you agree that the Columbia-class submarine is a strategic asset that will benefit more than just the Navy?
Sir, I absolutely agree that it is probably the most vital part of our strategic nuclear deterrent. The current force is aging and has to be modernized, so that is why it's #1 on our priority in terms of as we looked at this budget and how we intended to roll it out. It is going to be even more relevant in a more complicated world with powers who have greater ability to project power both under the sea and in other areas. And so it is absolutely vital to our future, and that's why it's such a priority for us in our budget.
So this asset will carry 70% of the nuclear arsenal, and yet the Navy seems to be the only one covering the bill. Secretary Modly or Admiral Gilday, do you believe that the Navy is shouldering a disproportionate share for this asset?
Well, we work under the top line that we're given to work under, sir, and so that's how we're managing it. We prioritize it. I think there are a lot of discussions being held both in the halls here and other places about how we might come up with more creative ways to fund that program, because frankly it's putting a huge pressure on our shipbuilding budget. It's 25% now. It's going to escalate to 31%, and if we also have this goal of growing a fleet to 355, or I like to say 355 plus, we're not going to be able to do all those things. So we're digging hard inside our own budget to see where we can free up dollars for this. There may be some creative ways to look at unexpired or unused or unobligated funds to try and fund that, but we're looking at every possible way to do that but we can't abandon it. So,
well, I would agree, and I think you'd find support here on the committee. We need to get creative because this is a national strategic asset, and I don't think we should be taking it just out of the shipbuilding budget. But to this point, what steps are you and OSD taking to ensure the Columbia-class submarines procurement timeline remains less volatile than our current experience with Virginia-class? Admiral Gilday, I'm glad to hear you talk about how that we are committed to fully funding Columbia, but what are the steps we're taking to make sure that procurement timeline?
Probably the best example I can give you, Congressman, is the fact that when we begin building that submarine later this year, 83% of that submarine will be designed. If I compare that against Ohio, 2% of that submarine was designed when we started building it. Virginia-class, less than half of that submarine was completed design by the time we started building it. So it's vitally important, for the reasons stated previously, to stay in the timeline to begin its first patrol in 2031, that we absolutely remain focused on it. And the teamwork with the shipyards is absolutely critical here in order to stay on that timeline as well.
Thank you, gentlemen. Mr. Rogers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your service and for your availability today. Admiral Gilday, to address a gap in the Homeland Defense due to program cancellations, Missile Defense Agency is looking at a regional defense system to serve as an underlayer to the GMD system. Specifically, they're looking at the Aegis Ashore using the SM-3 Block 2A missiles. How would that impact your BMD mission?
Sir, it would allow us to use BMD-capable ships for other missions besides defending the homeland. And so it would give, I think it would give more flexibility to senior decision makers in terms of how they would use those assets if that gap were covered with a land-based Aegis system with essentially the same capability as the ships.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned the land-based system. Has there been discussion about moving the Aegis ashore from the Navy to the Army, given that there's talk about expanding that capability?
Sir, not that I'm aware of.
Great. Over the last decade, we've seen significant growth in the Chinese battle fleet, and they've surpassed the United States now as the largest Navy. We're seeing significant investments by both Russia and North Korea in their submarine technologies and capacity. How do you compete with that?
Sir, so I go back to the priorities, right, in terms of making sure that the fleet we have today, 70% of which we're going to have in 2030, is ready and capable to fight. That 21% of our budget is focused on lethality and modernization so that we have weapons that can actually outstick our adversaries with great speed. And that includes doubling our investment in hypersonics. And so we're working very closely with the Army and the Air Force as we develop not only the airframe that we should begin doing testing here together very soon, but also the warheads.
Thank you. General Berger, you talked in your opening statement about this being an inflection point and that we can't waste time, we have to start acting now. But when I look at your PB-21 numbers, I don't see much difference between PB-20. What am I missing? If we really got to do something now, why is it not reflected in larger numbers in the PB-21?
This year is the pivot. This budget was largely built in July and August based on our annual fiscal cycle. So I could fit some things, I could change some things, but not the significant ones that we need to make. In 22 and 23, it will be significantly more. But even in this one, there's investments in things like ground-based anti-ship missiles that you wouldn't have seen a couple years ago at all. But this is the direction the integrated force must go.
Great. In your written testimony, you also talked about an acquisition review of legacy programs. You talked about F-35, the Joint Light Tactical Vehicle, and the Amphibious Combat Vehicle, and others. And like you said, we may have to turn loose of some legacy programs. When do you think that review is going to be complete and ready for you to take action?
I think much like the integrated force structure assessment in terms of ships, it's not going to be ever over because we have an adversary that's moving. So we've completed the first round of it. We know the size of the Marine Corps that we're going to need, we think, in 10 years from now. And much of the capabilities and capacities are driven by the size of your force. We'll need to make adjustments to the programs of record based on a couple things. First, the size of the Marine Corps. We're not going to waste the resources you give us. Second, the threat. We have to match, we have to maintain an overmatch all along. So as long as we're in great power competition, we are going to gauge off of a pacing threat, which means we're going to increase, decrease.
From our previous conversations, I very much like the aggressive approach that you're taking. I'm just wondering when we're going to start seeing you take the knife out and start taking some action. Will that be in the 22 budget or what?
This year, in this budget, we reduced the manpower equivalent of a couple thousand Marines. That probably won't be the largest one or the last. Why? I think every service chief would love to have a bigger force, but you need us to be lethal, you need us to be mobile, you need us to be integrated with the Navy. So we're going to reduce the size of the Marine Corps, some this year, more next year. You'll see the impacts to programs, I think, later this summer and into the spring of next year. But again, it'll be it's not a snapshot in time where we freeze, or else an evolving threat, we'll stare at a signpost and it'll be moving.
Well, I like your leadership on this. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Larson.
Thank you. Secretary Modley and Admiral Gilday, the FY 2020 NDAA included a provision that required the SECNAV to conduct real-time sound monitoring at no fewer than 2 Navy installations and their associated outlying landing fields. And so we have a very parochial interest there trying to deal with some issues around NAS Whidbey Island and OLF. But I think this is a good compromise step, moving away from the traditional model that we've used and moved to real-time noise monitoring. The plan, though, for additional monitoring is due to Congress by March 20th, according to the language in the law. So is the Navy planning to submit that plan to Congress on time?
Sir, my understanding that they're wrapping up that study and that it's on track to be delivered on time.
So the plan for the study is due on March 20th, and then the implementation then would
That's right.
would occur. So you're saying by March 20th we'll have the plan.
I have not heard anything otherwise in terms of our ability. I will check into that for sure and get back to you, sir.
Earlier is better, certainly. So then with that plan, I then assume the Navy is prepared to begin implementing the real-time monitoring soon after.
Sir, I'll get back to you on that one, sir. I was just reading about that this morning, that they were preparing to deliver this plan, but I have not seen it yet. So once I know more of the details, I'll get back to you on that, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. We'll be in touch. Appreciate that. And then second, for the Secretary or Admiral, you can choose really. The EPA signed interim guidance in December providing recommendations to address groundwater contaminated with PFAS and PFOS. And we've had this debate here. And of course, again, we have the issue on Whidbey Island, and we'll note the Navy's commitment to Whidbey Island has been great in helping the city of Coupeville deal with their well situation, but we still have groundwater issues there. Is the Navy following the EPA guidance, continuing to follow the EPA guidance?
Sir, so we finished our investigations, and in areas like Coupeville where we found contamination, we have taken steps, for example, to provide suitable drinking water from other sources. We have money in the budget this year, about $60 million, to address cleanup, and so we're moving through cleanup in 20 and 21. So in both 20 and 21, we have money towards cleanup, and the last report that I saw, that we were on track to conduct that cleanup on time.
Excellent. We'll follow up with you on that too. There may be some. I think every community is unique, and we have some unique issues there at NAS Whidbey Island and Coupeville as well. So we'll follow up with you on that. I appreciate that. Third question I have has to do with the readiness question, especially as it applies to the F-18s, specifically the Gs. The Growlers are at NAS Whidbey Island, and again, it's a Growler question. But what is the given the percentages you've outlined with the Es and Fs? Do you know the readiness level of the Gs?
Yes, sir. It's over 60% right now. Well, we've learned a lot from what we've done with the Super Hornets, right? The Es and the Fs, and so we were at 50. We could not break 55% mission-capable aircraft for a decade, and so we took a deep look at our processes, and we're applying those same to our ship's maintenance. So we've now been sustaining above 80% for 4 or 5 months. So we're applying those same processes to every type, model, series aircraft in the inventory. So I expect that the Growler numbers will come up. They're headed in the right direction.
Excellent. So if, apologize, it's kind of a leading question, because if we can get to 80% plus on the Gs, does that change the number of Growlers that the Navy will need?
No, sir. It won't change. It won't change the requirement. We just have a more ready fleet.
Okay. I think that's it. I yield back. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Lamborn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your service, for your contribution, and Admiral, for your wife as well and what she contributes. I'd like to ask you about conventional prompt strike, presumably with a hypersonic glide vehicle. What is the need for such a submarine-launched capability, Admiral or Acting Secretary?
Well, one of the great challenges we have right now is that our adversaries have developed long-range hypersonic missiles that hold our forces at bay, make us have to operate farther and farther away from the first and second island chains. And so we have to develop some type of capability to be able to meet that. And so that's why we're developing this conventional prompt strike weapon, and we're working with the Army and the Air Force on this collaboratively. We are looking at all kinds of different options for how we might base that, some of which I can't discuss in an open forum, but would be happy to come in a closed forum and talk to you about that. So.
And we are talking about a conventional capability, not strategic or nuclear, but conventional. Would that affect strategic stability? Would it make the environment more unstable with our near peers?
Well, sir, I think the goal of everything that we're doing is to try and increase strategic stability, to maintain a strong enough deterrent force to keep our adversaries guessing and uncertain about their capabilities. So everything that we do is with that objective in mind. There's nothing that we do to try to create a more unstable security environment.
Does having such a submarine-based capability put our submarines under an unacceptable risk of detection and so forth?
I'll yield over to Admiral Gilday on that in terms of the actual operational elements of the attack submarine force.
Sir, I think anytime you fire a weapon, you face that kind of risk in terms of, particularly if you're firing from a concealed position like a submarine. But it's not just what you're firing, it's how you're going to actually maneuver to conduct the fight, right? So it's how we're going to fight, our concepts of operations. And so that'll be taken into account, and each situation where we employ those weapons will be a little bit different, so it'll be based in the fighting environment as well.
So are you confident that even if there is a risk, it would be an acceptable risk?
Sir, we would maneuver to make that risk accessible.
Okay.
We want to create a dilemma for the Chinese fleet commanders so that they don't know what vectors they have to protect themselves from.
Okay, thank you. And how would not having this capability affect your ability to operate in a contested environment with a near-peer competitor?
So I think the ability to have a long-range weapon at speed like hypersonics, it allows you to get in closer sooner. So it allows you to create a dilemma for the enemy. We actually outstick them with mass volumes of fire to put yourself in a position of advantage early.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate those answers. Changing gears, I'd like to ask you about the 4 public shipyards. And I know that the current budget includes funding to continue the virtual mapping of the public shipyards and some military construction funding for dry docks. When do you expect that the Navy will complete this mapping and begin increasing annual investments in the Shipyard Infrastructure Optimization Plan, SIOP, in line with about $1 billion annually that it's going to need?
Just at a high level, sir, this is about a 20-year program that we have that we absolutely must do with these public shipyards to modernize them, not just modernize the facilities, but modernize the way in which work flows through them more efficiently and more effectively. So we are starting already on this process of investing in this long-term plan. And I don't know if CNO has any more to say about that.
Yeah, so the mapping should take a couple of years in terms of doing the virtual mapping of all the shipyards and really taking a look at processes and how they can become more efficient. But at the same time, we're investing in infrastructure like dry docks. We just began work less than a month ago down in Norfolk on a dry dock that's 101 years old. We just did a ribbon cutting up at Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on a deep basin up there. And so at the same time, sir, we're taking a look at where we want to make deliberate investments. We know some things now that we have to fix. We have to replace cranes. We have to rebuild dry docks as examples.
Okay, thank you so much. I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Courtney.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. I've had a chance to meet with you all over the last few months or so, and again, just really impressive, serious people, and appreciate your testimony here today. Just real quick on the 30-year shipbuilding plan issue and the integrated force structure assessment. The reason why that's in statute on the 30-year is just that the shipbuilding takes a long time. The sub is about 65 months for Virginia-class. Columbia will be longer. Carriers, I think it's year 12 for the Ford carrier. So we need to have that longer sort of perspective because these investment decisions, again, have they're just years-long impact in terms of how Congress operates. The integrated force structure assessment, again, we look forward to seeing it, but I mean, without trying to quibble here, these are two separate endeavors. I mean, the 30-year shipbuilding plan is a budget requirement in law, and the integrated force structure assessment, just like the last one in 2016, I mean, that was a separate process, a good process. And the reason isn't necessarily to find out what's the top line, how many do we need? It's also about the fleet architecture. What's the composition of the fleet? Because when we talk about lethality, it matters, in terms of being able to see, where we're going over just a one-year budget period. So, for example, in this year's submission, you've got 2 salvage ships. We need them, they're important, but let's face it, the O plans for our near-peer competitors, China and Russia, attack submarines are really the tip of the spear in terms of, what we need out there. And cutting, that Virginia-class sub, I mean, again, I just think is at odds with the national defense strategy when you sort of drill down in terms of what real lethality is. So last year, Admiral Richardson, Admiral Gilday's predecessor, when he was testifying about boosting attack sub production to above the program of record of 2 a year, stated that with respect to our greatest gap between the warfighting requirement and current inventory, there is no greater need than the attack submarine fleet. It's a wide gap, and it's getting wider. So every single submarine counts against closing that gap. Again, at that point, we were talking about going above the program of record. Now we're in a situation where we're below the program of record of two a year. Again, I want to just salute the fact that in your unfunded priorities, you put at the top of the list restoring that submarine. Again, Admiral Gilday, we were up in Groton on Monday, and a couple months ago up in Quonset. You got a real firsthand look in terms of the workforce, the design completion, which you mentioned for both for the VPM and Columbia. What's the Navy's position about execution in terms of adhering to the 2 a year program? And in terms of just, is that a factor in the decision, or was it resources?
So it was definitely affordability in terms of that submarine being cut. If I could make a point about the force structure assessment, and so that work is done. And I think the reason you would benefit from having that inform the 30-year shipbuilding plan is because if we didn't use it to inform this plan, you'd go back to the 2016 assessment. And as you said yesterday, that 30-year shipbuilding plan is the headlights that we provide so that you know where we need to go. So I think if we can have those discussions with the Secretary of Defense, and once he's comfortable with that, I think that is all packaged and ready to come up to the Hill.
Yeah, Mr. Courtney, if you don't mind me commenting on this as well.
Because I have one more quick question. Yeah.
Just quickly about 30-year shipbuilding plan. We agree with you. We understand the congressional requirement. It's a requirement for the Secretary of Defense to deliver. He wants a little bit more time to understand it, and we're going to help him with that. And it's not going to be a long delay. It will, as you think about this 21 budget, you'll have plenty of information and enough time to be able to do that.
Okay, the chairman's plan is to get this to the floor, as you know, on a very aggressive schedule this year, which I support. Regarding Columbia, we talked again up in Groton about the fact that the NSPDF, which at least created authorities for incremental funding and multi-year, is a way of reducing costs. And if there's, maybe you could just comment in terms of whether the Navy's coming to us with more requests in that regard.
Yes, sir. So to your previous question, you asked about numbers per year. Yes, in terms of 2 a year. To close the gap of where we need to be, that's how we need to build. And if you ask me, if I could give you another ship today, what would it be? It would be a Virginia-class submarine. And your question was about the
incremental authorities.
Yeah,
maybe we want to take that for the record because I don't want to.
It's not the fund; it's the funding. That's the issue, is the funding that needs to go in that bin. I personally don't care what bin it's in as long as we can use it to build more submarines. But that's the issue, is fencing that money off. The authorities are terrific and help us tremendously.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to thank the witnesses for joining us. Secretary Miley, I want to begin with you. You've heard my colleagues talk at length about the underinvestment the Navy's making in shipbuilding. When you put that in contrast to our adversaries and the increased investments that they're making, the pace that they're building their navies, it is pretty concerning. 355 ships is the law, and we look today as the Navy's budget, only about 10% of the Navy's budget is devoted towards building ships. And if you look at the current path that you're on, we're only going to have a net increase of 8 ships in the next 5 years. You talked about getting to 355 by 2030. That is an impossible task based on the current pace. You heard my colleague, Mr. Courtney, talk about the incredible importance of our attack submarines. We're going to be down to 42 submarines, attack submarines, by 2028. All of those things lead me to this question. What is the Navy going to do in looking at reallocating resources to the shipbuilding account over the period in the near future through the 5-year defense plan, better known as the FIT-UP? Give me your perspective on how we do that, because you talked about 2030 being the focus on getting to 255. Tell me what you're going to do immediately to get us on that path.
Well, sir, thanks very much for that question. As you know, I've been pretty vocal supporter of the 355 ship Navy since I've been back in the Department of the Navy. And I would just take issue with your point about it being impossible. I don't think it's impossible. I think there are two things that have to happen for it to be possible. One is a reasonable plan that demonstrates how we can get there on an accelerated path, and political will.
Yeah.
That's it. Those two things to come together, then I think we can do it. My job is to develop that plan in a reasonable way, and also demonstrate that the answer isn't, oh, we need more top line to do this. Because I know that in our $207 billion a year budget, there's a lot of money in there that we could probably use a lot more efficiently. So I chartered about 2 weeks ago something called the Stem to Stern Review, and we're looking internally to see what we can stop doing that doesn't make sense for this future force. And that's what we're doing. So we're going to go through this process. I gave them I was very aggressive on the timeline. I said 45 days, we need some answers on this. What we need to get on this path from preliminary analysis that we've done is about $5 to $8 billion more a year. Relative to the overall DoD budget, it's a very, very small amount. But I'm not in the business of making trades on the overall DoD budget. I'm just in the business of trying to present a plan, advocate for the Navy for the reasons that are important for the nation, and sell that plan as something that's reasonable that can be done, and then the political will has to align around it, and then we can go do it.
Gotcha. Well, listen, thank you so much for being focused on getting us to 355. Thanks for saying it's not impossible. I put that out there just to get your thoughts on what the path may be going forward. I'm glad to hear from you that it is possible and that we are going to get on the path to do that. Admiral Gilday, I want to go to some of the comments that you've made. You talked about not just the ship component of the Navy, but the manning component of the Navy. And we see some of the things that have happened because of manning issues, the risk that the Navy has taken on, in many instances, unacceptable risk. And you talked about the shortfall of sailors being at about 6,000. It now looks like some of the new projections are closer to maybe 9,000 sailors. Can you give me your perspective on what the Navy can do to reverse this alarming trend? And what are we going to do to make sure as ships go to sea, we have both proper manning and training to make sure that our sailors have exactly what they need to do the difficult job we ask of them?
So, sir, thanks. So the answer is retaining them, right? Retaining that talent. And so that begins with their families and all of those programs that we have, including childcare, including housing, and the focus in our budget reflects it that we're putting on that. Right now, our retention numbers over the past year are at 75%. So we've exceeded at every pay grade our expectations in terms of the numbers we retain. A lot of that has to do with the good work that the Navy's done over the past few years to digitize many of the applications that we use for sailors. So to give you an example, we have a detailing marketplace now where on an app they can compete for jobs, and they can do this a year out so that their family has the understanding of where they're going to move next. It allows the family to actually, through these apps, take care of child care and housing reservations months out before they even report to the duty station. They seem like small things, but we're taking systems that are maybe 75 different websites, and we're collapsing it down to a single entry point through a microprocessing app like on your phone that just makes a world of difference for people. So it's really, sir, a long answer to your question, it's really putting a focus on people and families.
Thank you. Mr. Garamendi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think we need to really deal with the fundamental thing that's going on here. It's a sea change. The 355 ship Navy is yesterday's plan. If I'm at all perceptive of what's going on here, is that the Navy is rethinking the way it will operate and the equipment, ships, and other things that they need to operate, and that's underway. The Marine Corps, you're very clear that you're in the process of doing that. I sense, well, myself, that this is happening, and therefore a frustration about, let's share about what you're thinking. This may not be the forum in which that takes place, but underlying all of the questions that have come thus far, and my own, is, wait a minute, everything that we've been building and planning for, and suddenly, wait a minute, the sea change is occurring and you're rethinking this. Good. To the extent that you can, share with us soon the general outline of that rethinking. Commandant Berger, you said that you're not able, given today's budget, to make that shift today. I understand that. Nevertheless, we need to change our thinking. And we need to put in place in this NDAA and the appropriations the elements that allow you to continue that process. Right now, we're very much in the dark. We really don't have that. And therefore, we're we're clearly, I'm frustrated. I think my colleagues are also. The information we're hearing doesn't line up, or the information we're giving doesn't line up to what you're saying, or at least indicating. So, having said that, in 2.5 minutes, let me get to one of my favorite subjects, which I think all of you are aware of, and it's sea lift capacity. My new flag that I keep waving in front of you folks. Whatever that future holds, the current sea lift capacity, which is inadequate for at least the next decade, we need to think about how to bring into reality a sea lift capacity for whatever you plan out there. Big power competition. The Pacific is a long, big ocean, and we simply are not capable of sustaining the fight. I mean, it's very clear. I want to work with you on developing a national fleet. The bow wave of the Columbia and rockets and nuclear and other things is going to make it very, very difficult to provide the logistical sea lift support from the Navy budget. You were just talking about that. Is there another way to do it? I think there is. I think if we are to rebuild our merchant marine capacity in a way that builds that capacity in a militarily useful, Navy useful manner for both the transport of weapons, material, men, equipment, as well as fuel, I think we can do it without significant impact on the Navy budget. And the Navy budget, insofar as non-combat ships, would be for the specialty ships that are not now available, but would absolutely be necessary. So the Navy does that, and then the merchant marines over here. We have available to us programs that have not been used for a couple of decades. So I want to just put that on the table, pursue that with you, and obviously we don't have 38 seconds to answer all the questions here, but be aware we're going to have this with MARAD, Admiral Busby, and the like. And so I'll let it go at that. I'll yield back.
Thank you. Ms. Hartzler.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your support, and thank you as well for your support as well, Mrs. Gilday. You have mentioned several times about the improvements with the F-18s and their readiness levels, and we too celebrate that. This has been a focus of this committee for several years to get that up, and so we celebrate the 80% readiness milestone. I really think that we continue to build on that with this year's budget that you put forth, additional 24 new mission-capable aircraft. And as you know, the new aircraft have the most immediate and profound impact on the tactical aviation inventory and fleet readiness, which is why I am concerned that the budget request proposes to eliminate 36 Super Hornets for future year defense budget. So would you please speak to how this will impact the tactical aviation inventory, since that's 3 squadrons worth of aircraft that the Navy is no longer investing in? And it's my understanding the Navy has an existing strike fighter shortfall of approximately 48 aircraft. So could you please speak to the impact and the potential operational risk that this will bring to our readiness?
Ma'am, thanks for the question. The cuts this year were due to affordability, and so we made what we thought were balanced risk discussions based on what we could afford given the current top line. The mission-capable jets, the path that we're on right now to get the most we can out of the fleet that we have, including modernizing our existing Super Hornets to Block 3s, puts us on a good path. As you know, the numbers of our F-18 Super Hornets are above 650. The fleet that we really need when we have our 4th and 5th gen mix is around 785. And so we're trying to maintain that path through the FIDP and beyond.
Will you be able to maintain the 80% target for mission-capable aircraft by cutting these aircraft out?
Yeah, we think we will. So the fact that we've reduced the buy doesn't necessarily affect our ability to reach 80% mission capability.
Okay.
Mission-capable aircraft, excuse me.
I'm still concerned about this decision and the cost that it could bring to the aircraft, because you have current production lines that help bring the parts and the service to the modernization effort. And if you cut out that new line, then that could jeopardize the ability to get your parts and for the modernization. So could you please elaborate on whether the Navy has assessed what if additional cost will be incurred should the Super Hornet production line be shuttered? And can you provide this cost analysis to the committee?
Ma'am, if we could, I'd like to get back to you with some more detailed information on that so that we can lay it all out for you in a way that makes sense and gets to the details that you're asking for.
And you said that the cuts were due to the lower top line. Are you saying that if we were to add additional funds, you would support reinstating those new aircraft and pushing that out?
I think it would go into the prioritization mix as we took a look at what we really need, based on the time frame that we're given.
Okay, very good. Switching gears, talking about munitions, certainly we have a lot of challenges with that. Our stockpiles of high demand preferred precision-guided munitions have been significantly reduced, as we all know, over the last 15 years. So in order to meet the objectives of the National Defense Strategy to support globally and integrated defense planning for contingencies, we need to procure sufficient inventories of munitions by a healthy industrial base. So what is your assessment of risk in the Navy's precision-guided and preferred munitions request, and what specific actions are you taking to manage stability, capability, and capacity risk in the U.S. munitions industrial base, to include reducing critical supply chain dependencies sourced from outside the United States?
Ma'am, in terms of our budget this year, and I talked about a focus on both readiness and lethality, and 21% of our budget dedicated to that. So a large portion of that is dedicated not only to modernizing our ships and aircraft, but filling our magazines with weapons. So that's not only our ships, but also our air wings. And to get to your last point in the supply chain, ma'am, I'd have to get back to you on that with more details.
Great. Thank you very much. Yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Gallego.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Admiral Gilday, I understand the P-8A Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft are the best submarine hunting aircraft in the world. Would you agree with that assessment?
Yes.
Thank you. Can you please describe to us and me in an unclassified way how we use our Poseidon aircraft specifically with respect to Russia and China?
So it's the most effective platform that we have for not only wide area search, but also localization, and so that we can actually find, fix, and if we're in a position to finish a Russian submarine. And so the capabilities of those P-8s, I think the best testimony is the fact that all of our allies and partners are lining up to buy the P-8. Tremendous capability.
So knowing that, were you surprised to see the department see in one of the cuts a P-8 cut from last year's budget to help for this border wall?
Yes, sir. Before my time, I can't speak to that, to the decisions that were made in the last budget.
Okay. Acting Secretary Modley, the recent reprogramming notice says that the items above last year's budget requests were what was stolen from, but the Navy says that we need 138 P-8As and we only have funding for 120. How is the reprogramming anything other than arbitrary and capricious if the Navy is disagreeing with the department's rationale for completing this theft of its budget?
Well, sir, those decisions are made by the Secretary of Defense. We support them as he makes them, but he has lots of trade-offs that he has to make for other competing priorities. We would obviously love to have more P-8s, clearly. It's an incredible weapons platform. We want a lot of our allies to have them too. So we are looking for ways to work with our allies to get them involved in the program so that Boeing can continue to produce them out in Washington.
Were any of you consulted before being informed that your budget was being cut by Secretary Esper and others in the administration? Did they talk to you? Did they ask your preferences if this was, necessary or not necessary?
Well, sir, we go through a continual process on budget negotiations and deliberations, so we're consulted all along the way. Ultimately, we don't have a veto.
Well, no, and I understand that. I definitely understand you guys don't have a veto, but more along the lines of, did Secretary Esper or other aspects of the administration at least talk to y'all before they went and did this cut? Because this is not just unfunded money like it was last year. This is actual equipment, very necessary equipment.
We knew that they were looking at a variety of different options, and then at the end, those options were presented to us.
Right. Admiral Gilday, again, understand that you didn't have a veto over any of this.
Sir, I was not consulted before that final decision was made in the $3.8 million under the provision 284.
Okay. Assuming the same thing, General Berger?
That's correct, sir.
Okay. So moving on. Our national posture in Asia is mostly naval and highly concentrated in very small and specific parts of Japan and Korea. This committee recently heard testimony from former East Asia DAST Abraham Denmark that the relatively small number of large bases that we have in Asia should be diversified to a new approach that prioritizes new airfields, new people positioning, and new posture. What is your take on the survivability of our naval assets in Asia and the supply lines across the Pacific should the balloon go up? We'll start with you, Admiral Gilday.
So I think based on the fact that where we're located, we have concerns, which is why we're making investments in better weapon systems. And it's not just on the kinetic side, it's the investments that the department's making in space and in cyberspace to put us in a much better position against those types of threats.
And just because I have want to get one more question in, how does this budget take the necessary steps to increase the survivability of our Indo-PACOM assets against Chinese threats or aggression? Mr. Botley.
Well, as I mentioned before, everything that we did was to increase the readiness and lethality of our forces that are, particularly the ones that are deployed. And so that's really what our primary concern is right now. So as we look to the future, we're looking at some of these other bigger issues in terms of how do we distribute our force, how do we do more distributed maritime operations, what types of ships will we need to do that, to support that, et cetera. And those are the types of changes and things that you will see that will be different in this force structure assessment than the one that was done 4 years ago.
Great. I yield back my time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Kelly. Sorry, Mr. Kelly. Sorry to... Hello. Mr. Kelly. Oh,
thank you.
Look here. Sorry.
Thanks, Mr. Mitchell. I first want to talk about, I want to be real clear. I support our border, and particularly our southern border, and building the wall. However, during the recent reprogram, $650 million was diverted from an LHA American class of amphibious ship, which is built by Huntington Ingalls, a massive shipbuilder in Mississippi. The impact that will be felt will be loss of jobs, and it will hurt the industrial shipbuilding base. I think consistency, long-term maintained plans are key to maintaining our industrial base, and they, much like an aircraft carrier, can't turn on a dime. And so when we destroy that industrial base, we don't just get it back when we decide we want to build a different ship. So what is the plan to get this ship back on track, either Mr. Secretary or Admiral Gilday?
So I can speak to the high level on that. We did end up, the funding was moved from this year for that. However, it did not change the delivery time for that ship. We actually pulled that ship forward and plan on starting that in FY23. In previous plans, it was either 24 or 25. So it's actually, over the course of the last couple of years, we've actually accelerated the delivery of that ship. And we understand and we're very sympathetic to the impact it might have on employment down there in Mississippi. That is a critical shipyard for us, so they do fantastic work, and we want to make sure that we maintain a healthy shipbuilding capacity down there. But this was just a decision that was made here at the end game.
Understand, but what we do is lose long-term effects for short-term gains. And you can't buy that back. We see that when we make cuts in personnel to the Marine Corps or the Navy or the Army. When we make those cuts, and then the next year we go, well, that number was a little too low, so we'll just build it back. You can't replace that E6 with a trainee. That's 12 years of experience to get there that we can't replace. It's the same way with the industrial base. If they're geared up and tooled up to build a ship, and we change the plans, they can't just next year when we change them back, get back to the same spot because they've lost that. Those guys are working somewhere else. Those guys and girls are doing a different job somewhere else, and we can't rebuild it. We just have to be real careful about doing that. And I'm a firm believer in all of our services owe us. Every year we ask you, what are your personnel numbers? What are your requirements? And when you give those to us and then we change them the next year, it makes it very difficult for us to plan and our industrial base to plan. And we've got to adhere to that because I'm a kind of a patent guy. An 80% plan violently executed is better than a 100% plan 2 days after it mattered. And so I just ask that we keep that in mind when we're dealing with the industrial base. General Berger, in your planning guidance, you talk about the need for smaller, more maneuverable Marine Corps that gets back to expeditionary routes. It suggests we may need different platforms or amphibious ships to do this. Can you tell me what you envision in this, General Berger?
So for the last 2 decades, we did what the nation needed us to do in the Middle East, but that's not what you need us to do in the future. You need us as part of an integrated naval force because our view, that's an asymmetric advantage that we have by a wide margin. We need to sustain that margin. So in simple terms, we need, instead of a land force that could sometimes, if we really tried and it would be really painful, get aboard ship, we need to be a naval force that you can send where you need to, the commander can send where they need to, can go ashore when they choose to, back aboard ship, very dispersed, very distributed. In other words, pose an adversary a real challenge that it makes his day really hard. That's what we got to do.
Thank you, and I agree, and I think that 98-year-old Marine would agree also. He's not here anymore, Commandant, but I think he would definitely agree. And Secretary Modly, I want to talk a little bit. I just visited a DDG when I was in Rhoda and visited our great sailors out there, and we had a discussion yesterday. But I just want you to talk about your optimized fleet response plan and how personnel figures into that.
Well, one of the things that we're trying to do, particularly in this budget, is adjust some of the problems we had in previous years with respect to the manning that we had on our ships. And I think that the CNO mentioned this earlier in terms of what he experienced back when he was on a DDG and what that had declined to over the years. And we started seeing the results of that in these horrible accidents that we had in the Pacific a couple years ago. So we're trying to adjust that to make that better. With respect to specifically about RP, we are doing a deep dive look on that. The Secretary of Defense actually hired an outside company, FFRDC, to help us look at that and look at better options for that. I would
apologize, gentleman's time has expired. Ms. Spear.